I am actually very pleased to introduce a good friend of mine that I happened to meet last year in Mexico City. She has been leading some great community engagement in the provincial area of British Columbia. She is a member of the staff team of the Greater Vancouver YMCA. She's also been leading some great work on reconciliation with Indigenous community on behalf of the YMCA. So please join me in welcoming Lindsey Martin from the YMCA of Greater Vancouver.
Growing up, I thought I was as Canadian as you could get. I was born and raised in Vancouver, Canada, and have pretty much spent my whole life there. Both of my parents were born in Vancouver, and their parents were also born in Canada. But really, both sides of my family originated from different areas in Europe. And it wasn't until the start of an event at my university that I first heard Vancouver referred to as the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This is an acknowledgement of the people who have lived on the land that is now called Vancouver since time immemorial. It is also a recognition that this land was never surrendered or given up willingly to colonizers. And it was in that moment that I started to question what I knew to be the history of Canada and my identity as a Canadian. In school, I learned about the history of many places around the world, places in Africa, places in Asia, places in Europe, and I learned about the history of Canada just as I learned about the other places in the world, told through the eyes of the victor, which, within the context of Canadian history, was also the oppressor. And two things stand out to me when I reflect back on learning about the Indigenous people of Canada. One, I understood it as ancient history about a group of people that no longer existed. And two, my understanding of our history was that the arrival and establishment of settlers in Canada was built on reciprocity, friendship, and trust with the Indigenous people of the area. It wasn't until years later I learned I was very wrong. I myself am not Indigenous to Canada. I'm a white woman of European descent whose ancestors were the colonizers. I'm not here to speak on behalf of anyone or any group of people. It is not my intention to tell a story that is not mine to share or to paint a picture that is not true for all. So why am I here? What am I doing on this stage talking about something that did not happen to me? Should I be up here talking about this? These are all the questions I've been reflecting on as I've been preparing this talk and really on a daily basis at home. I'm here to share my journey and experiences as I try and learn a difficult truth about the history of Canada. A history that is still unknown to many, and a history that is still unfolding today. And through this ongoing learning, I hope to learn where I fit in it all. And maybe you've done the same in your part of the world. So how do we stand up as advocates and allies and do our part in building communities where everyone's rights are respected, where everyone can thrive, and where everyone can live as they choose? Many countries around the world have been colonized throughout history, the impacts of which are still felt to varying degrees. Canada's colonial past is recent, and I've learned that there are still harmful government policies in place that continue to be an invasive force on many Indigenous people in Canada. I learned that the impacts of colonization and the intergenerational trauma that has been inflicted on Indigenous people in Canada has transcended generations and continues today. What stands out to me the most is that the cultural genocide that has taken place since the arrival of settlers largely stemmed from the creation of residential schools. Schools run by the government and Catholic Church that took children from their homes and placed them in schools where they had no contact with their families. They were not allowed to speak their language. Many children experienced physical and sexual abuse at these schools. The impacts of this trauma has carried through generations, and studies have now shown the ripple effect of intergenerational trauma. This means that children today continue to feel the trauma that their parents and grandparents experienced in residential schools. It all of a sudden felt to me like we weren't being real or honest about our history. It felt like we should be acknowledging and recognizing our shared past to learn from it and move forward together. It also felt like we should be taking more time to recognize, celebrate, and learn from the resilience and the strength demonstrated by so many Indigenous people in Canada, and the many languages, cultures, teachings, traditions, and stories that have remained strong. But I didn't know how, and I didn't know what the right first step was. My journey to find an answer to these questions really began about 2 years ago when I attended a national youth conference. And at the start of the event, we were split up into working groups of about 10 people, and we spent the entire week with only those 10 people. Our group was focused on discussing pathways to reconciliation. We were a group of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous young leaders from across Canada, and we became instant friends. We spent most of the week sharing stories of our lives and the communities we grew up in. And my world was flipped completely upside down when I learned about the many challenging life circumstances many people found themselves in due to the intergenerational trauma caused by colonization and the ongoing inequities that exist today due to the systems and structures in place. It was astonishing to me how ignorant and unaware I had been to what the extremes of life in Canada could look like for so many, and how unaware everyone I had been surrounded by my entire life was. Things like access to clean drinking water, health services, and education are just a few examples of services not readily accessible to some communities of my new friends. It was a challenging journey of listening and learning and unlearning a lot of what I knew to be true. And it took me hearing firsthand someone's lived experience. When I got home from the conference, I was flooded with different emotions. I felt sad that this was happening. I felt guilty for not knowing and for who I was. And then I felt angry for feeling guilty because that wasn't doing anyone any good. And then I felt even angrier at everyone and at myself for being so blissfully unaware. I think it was in that reflection that I also realized that we can't expect others to relive their traumas in order for people to understand or to care. Vulnerability and trust are built, not given. I think we all need to take responsibility for educating ourselves on what has happened and what is happening in our communities, not only within Canada, but around the world, because we are all neighbors. A few months after the conference, after a lot of reflecting with some friends and after asking a lot of questions to many mentors and community leaders in reconciliation, we secured some funding from our local YMCA, and we hosted a 4-day gathering open to young leaders in Canada that encouraged diverse participation of people from different areas and different backgrounds. And the goal of the gathering was to intentionally hold space for people to build relationships and to learn from one another with a focus on reconciliation. And the group had a really hard time coming up with one definition for reconciliation because everyone felt it was such an individual process and looked different to everyone. One commonality, however, is that everyone thought that it starts with and is centered on relationships. A quote by Dr. Chief Robert Joseph, a hereditary chief of the Gwaweyanook First Nation, who has devoted his life to bridging the differences brought about by intolerance, lack of understanding, and racism, both in Canada and abroad, summarizes this learning well. We must recognize our common humanity and permanent connection to one another. Our collective well-being rests in the relationships we build today. The largest component of the gathering was that everyone had to come with something that they wanted to teach the group, whether it was a topic of discussion, a workshop, a song, a game, a dance, anything. And it was incredible getting to witness the power of reciprocal knowledge exchange. It opened my eyes to the importance of listening, not to respond or to judge or to disagree, but to really understand what someone is saying and where they're coming from. Every single person around you has a lifetime of experiences and wisdom that we can all learn from. So I left those 4 days knowing that I did have a role to play in reconciliation, and not only a role, but a responsibility. But I was still struggling with what that looked like. Throughout this whole journey of learning, I've kept coming back to contemplating what my role in reconciliation is, while recognizing the privilege that I've experienced as a white woman. How do I support without causing more harm or taking up too much space? I kept coming back to those questions I mentioned earlier. Who am I to be talking about this? But is staying silent while so much damage still being done even worse? I'm still learning what my role in reconciliation is, but throughout this journey, I think I've come to one conclusion. Reconciliation is a collective effort. We are all responsible and have a role to play. And I think this translates to everyone, everywhere, within all contexts. We are all responsible and have a role to play in the collective well-being of our local communities and global community. Thank you.